streaming live. This is Tracking the Tropics.
Happy Wednesday, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another weekly episode of Tracking the Tropics. Today is Wednesday, of course, August 7th, and on today's episode, we're going to be talking about why the tropics are so quiet right now when they should be a little bit more active, but why we shouldn't be fooled. Before we get started, though, I want to remind everyone that we're streaming live to many cities across the Southeast in Texas, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and as well as a couple other states out there on apps and websites. So again, thanks for joining us. I'm Storm Teammate Meteorologist Amanda Hawley, also joined by Storm Teammates Ed Bloodsworth, and our featured meteorologist today is Chief Meteorologist Ross Whitley at WMBB in Panama City. Thank you, Ross, for joining us.
I'm glad to be here. Glad to be talking about the quiet tropics, thankfully. Yeah. That might change at any moment in time, and that's what we're here to discuss.
Absolutely. So yeah, we don't have a whole lot on tropical satellite right now, but as we mentioned, this is the time that we should start to see an uptick in tropical activity. But Ed, why are we not?
Well, it's amazing here. This is something that we've been mentioning periodically, really, for the last couple of months. You can look at the tropical Atlantic. This is the current satellite view. There are a couple of tropical waves. You'll see a couple of those little flare-ups of convection near Puerto Rico, near the Antilles. But these waves, as has been the case in the last couple of waves in the recent weeks, have had a very difficult time developing here. So at this point, the Hurricane Center is not expecting any tropical development across the Atlantic basin. So the Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean, Eastern, Western, and Central Atlantic here over the next 5-day stretch. And there are a couple of reasons why we're looking at this unusually quiet period, as you mentioned, Amanda, when we would expect things to start increasing. The first thing we tend to look at are the sea surface temperatures. This, what you're looking at, is the anomaly. So the areas of yellow and orange, and especially red, indicate where we have warmer than normal temperatures. But Ross, what we're looking at is the area just off of Africa, stretching into the Central Atlantic. That blue area, cooler than normal waters, and that's a very interesting fact. One of the first things that we're looking at is why we're not seeing too much development out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the contributing factor to that has definitely been abnormally large amounts of Saharan dust that have come off of the African coast, and that's been rather consistent, as well as our daily convection that's typically streaming off of the Cape Verde Islands out there has been a lot further south. So it's been much more toward the equator, and we've had a ton of dry air out there, so that's keeping our sea surface temperatures down. We wouldn't see them start to climb this time of year.
Yeah, and Amanda, we were watching this last week. We had a graphic when we zoomed over the African continent. You can tell we were starting to get into the Cape Verde season. We were able to pinpoint, I think, 4 or 5 different waves or areas of low pressure that were rolling in, developing on the African continent, rolling along the ITCZ, the Tropical Convergence Zone. But once they move over that area, it just sort of pumps the brakes on anything.
Yeah, they get mixed in with that Saharan dust, but you're right. We were last week looking at 4 of them on the African coast, just lined up, ready to move out into the Atlantic, which, could potentially have become a tropical cyclone as it moved out into the Atlantic. But those water temperatures, as those roll off, they're just too cool. And again, it mixes with all of that dust. So we like the cooler water temperatures. We like the dust, and the dust will seem to continue to come off the coast.
And now that we are into August, these are the areas that we typically watch. I mean, we typically, throughout basically the entire year, we look at the Gulf of Mexico, areas along the Gulf Stream off the east coast of the U.S., and then back towards the Western Caribbean as well. But then, of course, now we move into August and certainly September when we start to see the climatologically favored areas expand. So that includes more the areas around the Antilles, and again, farther out into the Atlantic basin as well here. So that's something interesting. But this is the look at the current water vapor imagery, and this is very telling. Ross, we were looking at that area of yellow and orange here. The water vapor that appears as dry air, but that, as you just mentioned, is another fresh dust plume that's emerged off of Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just it's a rather dense plume of dust that is moving across the Atlantic once again, and that will really limit convection as we go forward over the next couple of weeks. We're going to be dealing with that as it stretches eventually likely into the Caribbean and then probably southern Gulf of Mexico when that dust wave does finish off. And I think that really our pattern has been rather consistent. We've seen a couple of strong blocking patterns set up across the Atlantic. That's typical when you have a big high pressure ridge over Greenland. Then that gives us a big trough over the east and helps pull this dust off of the African continent. Typically, this time of year, you don't have that. You don't get that blocking type of pattern in troughs in the east. And we've seen this just continue, and it looks like as we go throughout this week, we're just going to keep ripping dust off of Africa.
Yeah, that's what you just saw there. That was the forecast model for the Saharan dust, and we saw one big plume over the Atlantic, but it looks like, according to forecast models, we're going to have a few more, perhaps even larger plumes of dust that will swirl off the continent, get pulled across the Atlantic, and again, you can even see as it approaches the Antilles, Lesser and Greater Antilles, and eventually moves into the Caribbean, still a very good concentration of dust. And again, what that does is with these weaker tropical waves that emerge off of Africa, we were showing you that little 3D image just prior to this, Amanda, that just really disrupts everything. So even if these waves move over warmer waters, you can just sort of think of it like a
cap.
Basically, it's basically just a cap, and that just stops development.
Yeah. So can you replay this future track?
Yeah.
Ed?
Let me go ahead and go back here. This was the this sort of explainer that we were just showing.
So check out how high in the atmosphere that dry dust is. It really does put a cap on all of that development. This dust reaches up to 20,000 feet in the atmosphere, and that is not good for tropical cyclones. They like to have healthy breathing systems, good outflow at the top, and when there's dust on top of it, they don't have that good outflow. But check out how the dust dissipates as it moves across the Atlantic. So we're not seeing this dust move across the United States, giving us those nice sunsets, but we are seeing that and just great concentration of dust move off the coast of Africa. That last frame there, that's next Thursday, right?
Right.
So next Thursday, and we're still seeing these really dense plumes of dust. And keep in mind, the dust is made up of dry air. It's also got mineral dust in it, and it contains some turbulent wind. So not only strong wind shear, but downdrafts, which, I mean, with tropical systems, we like to see rising air, right?
And basically, I mean, it looks kind of strange. It's not something we typically look at every single day, but the more dust that we see there, the longer that we are in this pattern, Ross, the lower the chances are that we may have, a fairly quiet August. At least this is going at least a week into the first, at least now a week and a half into the month of August. And if this forecast paints out, it's very likely that we can make it through maybe the first third or maybe in the first half of August without seeing any kind of significant development, at least across the central Atlantic.
That's absolutely right. At least looking from this forecast here, that I would say through next Thursday, we're not going to see anything in the MDR, that main development region in the Atlantic, because it's just not sustainable with that amount of dry air over it. But I think that's a perfect segue into quiet seasons in the past. We've had very similar analogs to this year, being 99, 09, and 14. Two of those years, you had rather quiet years. 09, we still had to deal with Arthur. That ended up being an early season storm, and most everything stayed in the Atlantic, was formed near the coast of the eastern U.S. And then 09, we did have, or 99, we had Floyd. 09, we had Arthur, and then 14 probably being the one that sticks out the most is that we had one named storm before August 20th and ended up with 12 named systems by the end of the year. So it's still possible that as we go through August, we could remain quiet and end up a good number of storms.
Yeah, and the other year that I think, Amanda, that's worth mentioning, especially that Floridians would know very well, this year, we have a weak El Nino in place. For some of the forecasts start to weaken that El Nino a little bit more, get us back into a neutral phase. But I always go back to 1992 and Hurricane Andrew. Andrew did not form until well into August. So it took a long time for us to get even the first named storm of that season, and we all know what Andrew eventually would become a significant Category 5 hurricane that moved through South Florida. Now, the numbers that we are looking at here, these are those forecast numbers. They come out usually prior to the start of the season, but they get updated throughout the season. And Amanda, we did get an update from Colorado State just a few days ago.
Yeah, Monday they updated their forecast for the rest of the season, and their forecast didn't really change a whole lot. They're still predicting an average season, which means that we haven't seen a lot of activity so far this season, but we're still expecting those numbers, those same numbers. So 2 to 4 major hurricanes is forecast through NOAA, and actually we'll get an update from them tomorrow. But Colorado State's forecast is for 7 total hurricanes. So of course we had Barry, so they're still expecting 6 more, at least forecasting it, and 14 tropical storms. So from now until the end of November, we're talking about still a lot of formation possible.
Yeah, and Ross, we mentioned here that, with as quiet as it's been here, as of late, of course, we had Barry, but so far we're kind of on track with what we would consider to be an average season. I mean, the first 2 months, you would expect maybe 1 or 2 storms to form. So that right now we're kind of on track with what a lot of these forecast models have been saying.
Yeah, it seems like it's a quiet season because we get into hurricane season, everyone immediately thinks we're going to see hurricanes. And,
right.
But as you just mentioned, that typically the beginning of hurricane season is relatively quiet, and we are right on track for a normal season. And if we get a big uptick in activity going through September, it's likely that we probably hit a normal season.
Yeah.
But, the normal season, active season, below active season, the only significant stat there is how many landfalls.
Right.
And that's something that we don't forecast. That's not what we're forecasting here. We're forecasting how many storms. So it only takes 1 landfall. And as you said, we've seen that in the past. Michael last year,
yeah.
We had Harvey, we've had Katrina, we've had Andrew. Those are all significant storms. Some of those happening late season, some of those happening early season, some of those happening peak season. So never a good time to let your guard down.
Yeah, and you're obviously very familiar with last year being Hurricane Michael there. Do you want to talk about a little bit about how that was kind of forecasting leading up, and then even after the storm, you're still dealing with the effects, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We had quite a bit of damage here at our studio, so we are repairing our building. The studio ended up being okay, which was a miracle in itself, but our newsroom and our sales office are getting renovated, so to speak. When you have water come into the ceiling and most everything needs to be thrown out, you kind of need renovation. So we'll happily accept the renovation, but the area definitely is still going through recovery, and it's going to take quite some time. If you drive up from Panama City to I-10, that's 70 miles from the coastline, you'll see damage like the storm happened yesterday. So it's not something that gets fixed overnight.
No.
It's something that's going to take years of recovery. And as far as the visuals go, we'll probably won't see our forest look any kind of normal for 10, 15 years down the road. We'll say, hey, there's remnants 10 years from now, but at least it's starting to look like a forest should look.
Yeah, I remember when I went up there and visited actually your facility there about 6 months after the storm, and then talking with a lot of the residents around there. And of course, you guys are hearing this on a daily basis. The one thing that everyone keeps mentioning is after going through a natural disaster like that, whether it be, you look at a significant winter storm or a tornado or obviously a Category 5 hurricane in this case, that getting back to normal, it's not really getting back to normal. It's getting back to a new normal. And thankfully, I know I've noticed that you guys, businesses are starting to slowly reopen and everything. But you're right. It's amazing that some areas now, and as you're even telling us now, what are we, 9-10 months after the storm, that still look like they did 24 hours after Michael came through.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And everyone is dealing with it, and you become a little blind to it living here and going through it day in and day out. It really takes leaving the area and coming back to go, wow, this place got hit really, really hard. And people that come in, they get to see that firsthand. They're like, I don't know how you're going through this, how you deal with that. And it's like, well, it's life. We move on, we pick ourselves up, and we recover. And that's what we're doing here. And I think everybody in the area is, has a positive attitude about it, and we will come back stronger than ever. I do want to mention, while I have the time here, that the thing you always hear after a major storm is, "I'll never stay again," comment. And I think this is a good opportunity with a lot of people around the country watching that don't make the mistake the first time. Don't make that mistake the first time so that you get to say, "I'll never stay again." Thing is staying doesn't really do much. What are you going to save by staying? You can't do anything to your house during the storm. You can't do anything with your car during the storm. You can't do anything, period, during the storm. And then you're likely going to be dealing without power, without water, without food for several days. And in our case, it was a week. We had a week where most places didn't have power, water, or any of that. So if you feel comfortable living, basically camping, that's been destroyed for a week, then sure, stay. If you don't, then you probably should go, because you're not gaining anything by staying.
Right, absolutely, and that's a good time, I think, here as we are in this sort of lull in tropical activity at this point, this kind of unusual lull as we're now into what we'd consider to be the start of really the crux of the season, is to, now's the time to, when it's quiet, start thinking about your plans. Where would you go if you need to evacuate, and make sure you have all of your necessary things. Make sure your pets are taken care of. Make sure now's the sort of time to start to call family members and friends. Say, you know what, if I need to evacuate Tampa, Panama City, Mobile, Galveston, wherever I live along the coastline, where am I going to go? And already set up those plans ahead with friends and family. And again, make sure you have all those necessary documents that you're going to need, insurance forms, medical forms, all that stuff that most of us really should have already had prior to the season. But at least now, while it's quiet, and now's a good time to always constantly review things and make sure that we are good to go just in case. And that's the word that we always try to end on here every week, Amanda, is that even though it's quiet now, it doesn't take long for it to just very quickly change and become quite active. So we all need to just be on our guard at all times. At
all times. And yes, we all have experience with it, go through it. And like Ross said, just don't stay. Prepare now so that you don't have anything that you're worrying about while you're gone. And should be good.
Yeah. The longer we can get tropical development, this graphic, as long as we can keep that tropical development expected, no tropical development over the next 5 days, the longer, the better it is for all of us here. So keep going, Saharan dust. Hopefully that continues to go on for quite some time, and hopefully these numbers don't really approach anywhere close to the forecast.
If we end up with a below average season, I think everyone will be happy. No doubt there.
I'll be the first one.
That's true. That's true. I have no doubt there either, Ross. But thank you, everyone, for joining us on this week's episode of Tracking the Tropics, especially our featured meteorologist, Ross Whitley from Panama City, and, of course, Ed as well here at Storm Team 8. We do these every single week on Wednesdays at 1:30 Eastern, 12:30 Central, and you can stream them on your app, your local station's app, and on this website that you're watching from right now as well. And regardless if there's tropical activity or not, we're going to be here talking about it, why there's not, or tracking whatever is out there and what it could become. So tune in every single week, and we will continue to keep us updated. For now, thank you for joining us for today's episode. And again, thanks, guys, for joining me on today's discussion.
Thank you for watching Tracking the Tropics.